Far the Watcher in the Fields. Fun Fee, a forgotten American legend. Before we begin this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American history, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what hours these documented stories reach. The year was 1852, when Jonathan Whitfield, a wealthy farmer from Greene County, Tennessee, first noticed the subtle changes in his wife's demeanor. Rebecca Morgan Whitfield had always been known for a composed nature and graceful presence among the county's elite. The Whitfield farm, Hickory Hollow, stretched over 1,800 acres of rolling Tennessee soil, where tobacco grew tall and corn stretched toward the sky like prayers from the earth. Jonathan had inherited the property from his father, along with the 43 individuals he kept enslaved to work the fields. The main house stood proud on a small rise, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun, overlooking the workers' quarters that lay hidden behind a grove of ancient oak trees. The Whitfields had been married for 7 years without producing an heir, a fact that had begun to cast a shadow over their otherwise prosperous life. Neighbors whispered, servants exchanged glances, and Jonathan's mother, still alive and sharp-tongued at 73, made no attempt to hide her disappointment during her monthly visits from Knoxville. Rebecca had suffered 3 miscarriages, each one leaving her more withdrawn than before. The last one, just 8 months prior to the events that would unfold, had nearly taken her life. Dr. Harrison, the only physician within 20 miles, had warned them both that another pregnancy might prove fatal. On a particularly humid evening in April, as the mockingbirds sang their complex melodies from the magnolia trees surrounding the property, Rebecca approached her husband in his study. Jonathan was reviewing the farm's accounts, a glass of bourbon at his elbow, when she entered without knocking, something she had never done before. "Jonathan," she said, her voice barely audible over the creaking ceiling fan. "There's something in the east field. Something not right." Jonathan Whitfield barely looked up from his ledgers. The farm had yielded a record harvest the previous season, and he was calculating how to expand the operation. "What do you mean, Rebecca? Speak clearly." "I saw a man there this morning," she continued, twisting her handkerchief between her fingers, standing still as a statue among the corn, just watching the house. Jonathan finally raised his eyes, noting the unusual pallor of his wife's face. "One of the field hands, I presume?" "No." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "Not one of ours. I've never seen him before. He was tall, with strange eyes. Eyes like I've never seen." Jonathan laughed, a sharp sound that bounced off the mahogany-paneled walls. "You've been reading too many of those Gothic novels from Boston. Probably just a vagrant passing through. I'll have Jackson check the perimeter." But Rebecca didn't smile. "He looked at me, Jonathan, directly at me from across the field, as if he knew me." According to records later found in Rebecca's personal diary, she would spot this same figure 7 more times over the following weeks. Each time, he would be standing motionless, watching the house from different locations around the property. By the old well near the western boundary, beneath the willow tree by the creek that gave the hollow its name, at the edge of the family cemetery, where 3 generations of Whitfields lay buried. Rebecca documented each sighting meticulously, noting the time of day, the man's position, and her own growing sense of unease. Jonathan dismissed her concerns entirely. The spring of 1852 had brought unusual tensions to Greene County. There had been rumors of abolitionists moving through the area, and several neighboring farms had reported missing workers. Jonathan was far more concerned with these practical matters than with what he considered to be his wife's increasingly fragile imagination. What neither of them knew then was that Rebecca was already with child. The pregnancy that would change everything had begun. The Whitfield home had always been filled with whispers. The high ceilings and long corridors seemed to catch and hold conversations, carrying words to unintended ears. The enslaved house staff moved silently through the rooms, witnessing everything while remaining as invisible as possible to their owners. It was one of these individuals, a woman named Sarah, who had been with the Whitfield family since Jonathan was a child, who first noticed the changes in Rebecca's body. According to a statement Sarah gave many years later, when interviewed by a historian from Fisk University in 1961. She had approached Rebecca about her suspicions in May, just weeks after the first sighting of the mysterious man. Miss Rebecca was different, Sarah reportedly said, not just in her body, though I could tell she was carrying. It was her eyes. They'd follow things that weren't there. She'd stare at empty corners of rooms like she was watching something move across them. Rebecca confided in Sarah about her pregnancy before telling her husband. The joy that should have accompanied such news was instead replaced by a deep, inexplicable dread. Rebecca made Sarah promise not to tell anyone, not even Jonathan, until she was ready. This secrecy would later be noted by the county doctor as the first sign of Rebecca's deteriorating mental state. The Whitfield farm maintained an unusual quiet that summer, while neighboring properties hosted lavish barbecues and dances. Jonathan kept to himself, concerned with business matters and increasingly worried about his wife's behavior. Rebecca had taken to spending hours in the nursery, a room that had been prepared and left empty after each of her previous miscarriages. Sarah reported finding her there at odd hours, sitting in the rocking chair by the window, staring out toward the east field where she had first seen the strange man. It wasn't until late June, when her condition became impossible to hide, that Rebecca finally told Jonathan about the baby. The news should have brought celebration, but Jonathan's journal entries from this period reveal a man caught between hope and fear. She came to me today with news that under different circumstances would have brought me to my knees with gratitude. He wrote on June 23rd. We are to have a child at last. Yet I find myself troubled by her manner. She speaks of the child as if it were already a complete person with thoughts and intentions of its own. When I expressed my joy, she looked at me as if I had failed to understand something essential. Dr. Harrison has been summoned. I pray he finds nothing amiss beyond the natural anxieties of an expectant mother who has known loss. Dr. Harrison visited the farm the following day. His medical records, preserved in the Greene County Historical Society archives, note that Rebecca's physical health appeared excellent. Far better, in fact, than during her previous pregnancies. Patient displays robust vital signs and none of the concerning symptoms present in her earlier gestational periods. He wrote. However, She exhibits unusual fixations and what might be described as paranoid ideation regarding the nature of her pregnancy. The doctor prescribed bed rest and calming teas, standard treatments for what was then diagnosed as feminine hysteria. He advised Jonathan that such psychological peculiarities were not uncommon in pregnant women and would likely resolve after the child was born. Jonathan, eager to believe this reassuring prognosis, threw himself into preparations for the heir he had waited so long to welcome. What Jonathan didn't know was that Rebecca had confided something to Sarah that she dared not tell her husband or the doctor. According to Sarah's later testimony, Rebecca had whispered to her one evening while being helped into her nightgown, "This child isn't growing inside me. I'm growing inside it." The summer heat pressed down on Hickory Hollow like a physical weight. July brought temperatures so high that the corn seemed to wilt before one's eyes, and the usually busy paths between the fields and the main house stood empty during the brutal midday hours. Rebecca's pregnancy progressed with unusual speed. By August, she looked as though she were already in her final month, though calculations based on her last cycle suggested she should only be in her second trimester. Jonathan, initially elated by the apparent health of both his wife and unborn child, began to notice troubling patterns in Rebecca's behavior. She refused to eat in his presence. She would not allow mirrors in her room. Most distressingly, she had taken to locking her bedroom door at night, something she had never done during their marriage. According to household records, it was during this period that Jonathan began to sleep in the guest quarters at the opposite end of the house. In letters to his brother in Richmond, he confessed his growing concern that the pregnancy had affected Rebecca's mind in ways the doctor had not anticipated. "I find myself married to a stranger," he wrote in early August. "A woman who bears my wife's face but seems possessed of different thoughts, different movements. Even her voice has taken on an unfamiliar cadence. Yesterday, I overheard her speaking in the nursery, though she was entirely alone. When I inquired as to whom she was addressing, she smiled in a way that made my blood run cold and said, 'Just becoming acquainted with our son.' She seemed certain the child is male, though Dr. Harrison has made no such determination." As Rebecca's body expanded, so too did the tension within the Whitfield household. The house staff reported hearing arguments behind closed doors, Jonathan's deep voice rising in frustration, Rebecca's responses too quiet to discern. Sarah, who remained Rebecca's primary attendant, noted in a personal journal discovered decades later that her mistress had developed strange eating habits, craving raw meat and large quantities of salt. More concerning were the moments when Sarah would enter a room to find Rebecca standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on some invisible point, her lips moving soundlessly. By September, Jonathan had begun making discreet inquiries about specialized doctors in Nashville and even Richmond, physicians who dealt specifically with disorders of the female mind. These inquiries, documented in his correspondence, suggest he was preparing to have Rebecca committed to an asylum after she delivered the child, a common fate for women whose behavior deviated from social norms in ways their husbands or fathers found troubling. What happened next would be pieced together later from multiple accounts, none entirely reliable, all tinged with the particular superstitions and prejudices of the antebellum South. On September 15th, a thunderstorm of unusual intensity struck Greene County. The Whitfield farm, situated on relatively high ground, was nevertheless battered by winds strong enough to uproot several of the old oaks that lined the drive. Lightning struck with such frequency that, as one field hand later described it, night turned to day over and over, like God himself was having trouble with the lantern. It was during this storm that Rebecca went into labor, nearly 2 months before her expected due date. Jonathan, having retreated to his study with a bottle of bourbon to weather the storm, was informed by a frantic Sarah that the baby was coming. Dr. Harrison, who lived in the town of Moshame some 7 miles away, could not be fetched due to the dangerous conditions. Jonathan's journal entry from that night consists of just one line: "God help us all." Sarah, who had assisted in countless births on the farm, took charge of the situation. Rebecca was moved to her bed, which had been prepared with old sheets. The few other house servants present were dispatched to boil water and gather clean linens. Jonathan, ashen-faced and visibly shaken by the circumstances, stationed himself at the bedroom door, neither fully entering nor completely abandoning his post. According to Sarah's account, the labor was remarkably brief for a first successful birth. Less than 3 hours after the first pains began, Rebecca was ready to deliver. It was at this point Sarah would later testify that the already strange circumstances took a decidedly disturbing turn. Miss Rebecca, who had been crying out like any woman in the throes of childbirth, suddenly went silent, Sarah reported. Her eyes, which had been squeezed shut against the pane, opened wide. She looked past me toward the window, and her face changed. It wasn't fear I saw there. It was recognition. Sarah turned to look at what had captured her mistress's attention. Through the rain-lashed glass, barely visible in the intermittent flashes of lightning, stood the figure of a man. The same man, Sarah would later insist, that Rebecca had described seeing in the fields months earlier. Tall, unnaturally still, with eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. When Sarah turned back to Rebecca, the baby was already emerging. The birth itself, as documented in multiple accounts, was remarkably easy. As if, one report stated, the child was eager to enter the world. Jonathan, hearing the infant's first cry, finally entered the room fully. Approaching the bed where his wife lay with their newborn son cradled in her arms. The historical record becomes muddled at this point. Jonathan's journal entries stop entirely for nearly 2 weeks following the birth. Sarah's testimony, given years later, contains contradictions and elements that scholars have attributed to the superstitious nature of the time. What seems clear is that something about the child's appearance caused immediate concern. Dr. Harrison, who arrived the following morning once the storm had subsided, made a clinical note that the infant, while otherwise healthy and well-formed, displayed an ocular anomaly of significant nature. This clinical language likely referred to what household staff more bluntly described. The baby had unusual eyes. Eyes that, according to multiple witnesses, did not resemble either Jonathan's deep brown or Rebecca's clear blue, but instead were a distinctive amber color with vertical pupils like those of a cat or snake, as one account put it. Jonathan Whitfield, confronted with his son's unusual appearance, reportedly turned to his wife and asked a question that would echo through the county for years to come. Who is the father of this child? Rebecca's response, recorded independently by both Sarah and a kitchen servant who was present, was cryptic but chilling. He has been watching us from the fields, waiting. Now he no longer needs to wait. While unusual eye colors and even certain congenital conditions affecting the pupils might have medical explanations, the reaction of Jonathan Whitfield suggests he saw something in his supposed son that went beyond natural variation. Records from the Greene County Courthouse indicate that, within 3 days of the birth, Jonathan had summoned his lawyer from Moshame to revise his will, explicitly excluding the newborn child from inheritance of the farm or any Whitfield family assets. The baby, named James despite Jonathan's objections, became the center of increasingly disturbing events at Hickory Hollow. Household staff reported that the infant never cried, even when hungry or unattended. More unnervingly, multiple witnesses claimed that James seemed to track movement with an awareness that should have been impossible for a newborn. Dr. Harrison, making weekly visits to check on mother and child, noted the baby's precocious development and unusual alertness, but attributed these observations to the natural tendency of new parents and household staff to project adult characteristics onto infants. Rebecca, meanwhile, appeared to recover quickly from the birth, regaining her strength and figure with surprising speed. However, her mental state, as documented by both Jonathan and Dr. Harrison, continued to deteriorate. She insisted on keeping the baby with her at all times, refusing to allow a wet nurse despite this being the common practice among women of her social standing. She spoke to James in low, conspiratorial tones when she thought no one was listening. And, most troublingly, she began to make references to when they come for him, though who they might be she never clarified. Jonathan, increasingly convinced that the child was not his biological son, launched a discreet investigation into possible lovers his wife might have entertained. This investigation, conducted primarily through his overseer Jackson, yielded no results. No one among the household staff or field workers could recall Rebecca meeting privately with any man other than her husband. The mysterious figure she claimed to have seen watching from the fields was dismissed as a hallucination, the product of a troubled mind. Yet something had changed in the dynamic between Jonathan and Rebecca. Where once he had dismissed her fears, he now seemed to share them, though for different reasons. Household staff reported overhearing him ask Rebecca repeatedly about the man with the strange eyes, his tone suggesting he no longer believed this figure to be imaginary. By October, just weeks after James's birth, Jonathan Whitfield had begun to spend less and less time at Hickory Hollow. Business trips to Knoxville and Nashville that would normally have taken days now stretched into weeks. When he was home, he avoided the nursery entirely and would not look directly at the child when Rebecca brought him into a room. County records show that during this period, Jonathan made substantial cash withdrawals from his accounts at the Moshame Mercantile Bank, funds that were never accounted for in the farm's financial records. Rebecca, for her part, seemed to retreat further into a private world shared only with her son. Sarah noted that her mistress had taken to walking the grounds at dawn carrying James and whispering to him as she traced and retraced a specific path from the main house to the east field, where she had first seen the mysterious figure, then to the family cemetery, and back again. When asked about these walks, Rebecca would smile vaguely and say only that she was showing him the way. The final months of 1852 passed in a state of suspended tension at Hickory Hollow. Jonathan returned from a business trip in early November to find that Rebecca had dismissed half the household staff without consulting him. Those who remained reported increasingly erratic behavior from their mistress. Periods of absolute stillness followed by bursts of frenetic activity, one-sided conversations with empty rooms, and a growing obsession with the phases of the moon, which she tracked in a journal using a system of notation that no one else could decipher. James continued to develop at an accelerated rate. By December, at just 3 months old, he could sit upright without support and had begun to form simple sounds that several household staff members insisted were attempts at speech. Dr. Harrison, making what would be his final documented visit to the farm on December 12th, noted that the child displayed development consistent with an infant of approximately double his actual age, a phenomenon he attributed to Rebecca's attentive care rather than to any medical abnormality. The doctor's notes from this visit contain one additional observation that would later be cited by investigators. Mrs. Whitfield continues to exhibit concerning behavioral patterns, including elaborate delusional systems involving her son's origins and purpose. Mr. Whitfield appears equally troubled, though in his case the disturbance manifests as increasing withdrawal and what might be termed selective blindness to the domestic situation. I have recommended that both parents consider a period of rest at the coastal property, though I doubt this advice will be heeded. The coastal property referenced was a smaller estate near Beaufort, South Carolina, that had come to Jonathan through his mother's family. It had stood empty for years, maintained by a skeleton staff, and visited only occasionally during the hottest summer months. Jonathan's decision to suddenly relocate his wife and child there in the middle of winter raised eyebrows throughout the county. The official explanation that Rebecca needed sea air for her health was accepted with skeptical politeness by their social circle. What no one knew at the time was that Jonathan Whitfield had no intention of accompanying his wife and son to the coast. According to a letter discovered decades later in the possession of his brother in Richmond, Jonathan had reached a breaking point in his ability to maintain the facade of normal family life at Hickory Hollow. "I can no longer share a home with them," he wrote on December 20th. "The child I cannot bring myself to call him my son watches me with knowledge no infant should possess. Rebecca speaks of him as if he were royalty returned to claim some ancient birthright. Last night I entered the nursery unannounced and found her kneeling before his cradle as one might kneel at an altar. She was speaking in a language I have never heard from her lips, rhythmic and guttural. When she became aware of my presence, she smiled in a way that made me understand I was looking at a stranger wearing my wife's face. I have made arrangements for them to be established at the Beaufort property indefinitely. I tell our neighbors it is for her health, but in truth it is for my sanity. Perhaps with distance I can determine what has happened to the woman I married and what manner of child she has brought into this world." Rebecca and James, accompanied by Sarah and 2 other trusted house servants, departed for Beaufort on December 23rd. Jonathan remained at Hickory Hollow, ostensibly to manage the farm through the winter months. According to county records, he filed papers on January 2, 1853, initiating divorce proceedings on grounds of adultery. A scandalous and rare legal maneuver for a man of his social standing in that era. What happened next would be pieced together from multiple sources. Telegraph communications between Jonathan and the Beaufort property caretaker, statements from the servants who had accompanied Rebecca, and reports filed by the Beaufort County Sheriff. On January 10, 1853, a fire broke out at the Beaufort property. By the time neighbors noticed the flames and organized a response, the main house was already engulfed. 2 bodies were recovered from the ruins, adult females identified by personal effects as Sarah, and one of the other servants who had accompanied Rebecca from Hickory Hollow. Of Rebecca and James Whitfield, there was no trace. The third servant, a young woman named Mary, was found wandering the beach the following morning, apparently in a state of shock. Her account of what had transpired, as recorded by the sheriff, raised more questions than it answered. They came for him, just as Miss Rebecca said they would. Mary reportedly stated, "Men, if they were men at all, walking out of the sea at midnight. Their eyes shone like his, like the baby's." Miss Rebecca was waiting for them, had been waiting since we arrived. She handed the child to the tallest one, and they spoke together in words I couldn't understand. Then she looked at me and said, "Tell Jonathan he was right not to trust his eyes, but wrong not to trust mine." The men returned to the sea, taking Miss Rebecca and the baby with them. The fire started after, I don't know how. Everything was wet with salt spray, but it burned anyway. Mary's testimony was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind. The official report concluded that Rebecca Whitfield, in a state of postpartum psychosis, had started the fire deliberately and fled with her infant son, possibly drowning herself in the process. Despite extensive searches along the coastline, no bodies were recovered, nor was there any sign that Rebecca had arranged transportation away from the area. Jonathan Whitfield, upon receiving news of the fire and disappearances, suffered what contemporary accounts described as a nervous collapse. He remained bedridden at Hickory Hollow for several weeks, attended by Dr. Harrison, and refusing all other visitors. When he finally emerged from this state, he ordered the Beaufort property razed to its foundations, the debris cleared, and the land sold. He withdrew completely from county social life and ran the farm through his overseer, rarely leaving the main house at Hickory Hollow. In 1855, Jonathan sold Hickory Hollow Farm and all its assets, including the people he had enslaved, to a tobacco merchant from Nashville. He relocated to Baltimore, where, according to city records, he established himself as an importer of European textiles. He never remarried and died childless in 1877, leaving his considerable estate to a series of educational and religious institutions. In his will, filed with the Baltimore courts, there was a curious provision. A trust established for the maintenance and security of the eastern boundary of the former Hickory Hollow Farm in Greene County, Tennessee, in perpetuity. This trust included funds for a stone wall to be built along this boundary and maintained indefinitely, though no explanation for this requirement was provided. The Whitfield case might have faded into obscurity, one more tragic footnote in the complex social history of the antebellum South, were it not for a series of discoveries made in 1961 by researchers from Fisk University's Department of Historical Anthropology. A team led by Dr. Marcus Wilson was conducting a study of plantation records to document the lives of enslaved people when they uncovered the journals, correspondence, and medical records referenced throughout this account. Their research also led them to Mary, the servant who had witnessed the events at the Beaufort property, still alive though elderly, and living with her grandchildren in Nashville. Mary's recollections, recorded in a series of interviews, remained remarkably consistent with her original testimony from 108 years earlier. She added one detail, however, that had not been included in the sheriff's report. The baby's eyes changed once Miss Rebecca decided to go with them. Before, they looked strange, like cat eyes, people said. But that last night, when the men came from the sea, I saw the baby up close. His eyes weren't like a cat's anymore. They were like deep water. You could see all the way down, but you'd never touch bottom. Dr. Wilson's team also discovered, while examining county property records, that the stone wall Jonathan Whitfield had established along the eastern boundary of Hickory Hollow was indeed maintained through the trust he created. More curiously, they found that since 1853, there had been 27 documented instances of damage to this wall, always in the same location, always on nights of the full moon in September, and always repaired quickly using funds from the trust. The current owners of the property, interviewed by Wilson's team, claimed no knowledge of these regular damages beyond, noting that sometimes local kids vandalized the old wall. They had never questioned the arrangement whereby a Baltimore bank periodically sent contractors to inspect and repair the structure. When shown photographs of the specific section that had been repeatedly damaged, the owners reported that they avoided that area of the property due to uncomfortable feelings they couldn't quite articulate. Dr. Wilson himself visited this section of the wall on September 15, 1961, 109 years to the day after James Whitfield's birth. His field notes from that night contain a final enigmatic entry. Arrived at eastern boundary wall at approximately 11:30 p.m. Full moon providing excellent visibility. The wall appears solid and well maintained, roughly 6 feet tall and 2 feet thick, constructed of local limestone. Temperature unseasonably cool. At precisely midnight, I observed what appeared to be movement in the cornfield beyond the wall. Perhaps an animal, though larger than one would expect. The figure, if it was a figure, remained stationary for several minutes, as if observing the property, before retreating into the deeper shadows. Most curious was the sensation I experienced while watching this area. A distinct impression that I was not observing my surroundings so much as being observed by them. I will not be returning to this location after dark, and I find myself grateful that my research here concludes tomorrow. Some histories, I believe, are best left undisturbed. The Fisk University research team published their findings on plantation life in 1963, but their discoveries regarding the Whitfield family were relegated to a brief appendix, deemed too speculative and insufficiently documented for academic publication. Dr. Wilson retired the following year and never published further on the subject. The stone wall he described still stands along the eastern boundary of what was once Hickory Hollow Farm, though the trust that maintained it finally exhausted its funds in 1986. Local residents report that the wall continues to sustain periodic damage, always in the same section, always under the September full moon. As for the whereabouts of Rebecca and James Whitfield, after that January night in 1853, no conclusive evidence has ever emerged. No bodies were recovered from the Beaufort coastline. No record exists of Rebecca establishing residence elsewhere under her own name or an alias. The last documented mention of either figure comes from an unusual source. A lighthouse keeper's log from Hunting Island, some 30 miles north of the Beaufort property, dated January 11, 1853, the day after the fire. The entry reads, "Unusual lights observed offshore around 200 a.m. Initially mistook them for a vessel in distress. Upon further observation through my glass, determined the lights to be stationary, hovering just above the water's surface. Counted 3 distinct points of illumination, arranged in a triangle. As dawn approached, the lights descended below the water's surface. In 23 years at this station, have never observed similar phenomenon." Below this entry, added in different handwriting, and apparently at a later date, was a single line. "The eyes of the deep ones have returned to the depths. May they remain there." The Whitfield case remains unresolved, a historical curiosity from a time when the lines between medical observation, superstition, and psychological understanding were still blurred by the limitations of the era. What truly happened to Rebecca Morgan Whitfield and her unusual son may never be known. The stone wall along the eastern boundary of the former farm stands as the only physical reminder of whatever Jonathan Whitfield feared might someday return from across that threshold. Those who have studied the case are left with Rebecca's enigmatic warning, delivered through her servant on that final night. Jonathan was right not to trust his eyes, but wrong not to trust hers. In the complex tapestry of historical truth, sometimes the threads that stand out most clearly are those that cannot be easily explained by the conventional wisdom of any era. In 1968, an unexpected development occurred when a collection of Rebecca Whitfield's personal effects surfaced at an estate auction in New Orleans. The items had apparently been in the possession of a family with no obvious connection to the Whitfields, and the provenance remained unclear. Among the artifacts was a leather-bound journal, water, damaged but partially legible, which appeared to have been maintained by Rebecca during the final months of 1852, and the brief period at the Beaufort property. Dr. Wilson, though retired by this point, was contacted by a former student who had attended the auction and recognized the Whitfield name from his professor's research. The journal was acquired and submitted for authentication, which confirmed that the handwriting matched samples of Rebecca's correspondence, preserved in the Greene County records. The most intriguing entries began in late November 1852, approximately 2 months after James's birth. November 26th. "Jonathan believes I do not notice his absence, or that I mourn it. How could I explain that his distance is a relief? He looks at James with such suspicion, such fear. If he knew the truth, he would not fear, but worship. The child grows stronger each day. His eyes, which caused such consternation at his birth, have become even more pronounced in their unusual appearance. I find them beautiful beyond description. Sarah has taken to avoiding his gaze directly, though she continues to help with his care. Only I understand what those eyes portend. Only I know who waits beyond the eastern field die." Several pages following this entry were too damaged to decipher, but a passage from early December was partially recovered. December 11th. He spoke today. Not the meaningless babble of infants, but a single clear word. Jonathan was mercifully absent, having ridden to Mosheim on business. Only Sarah witnessed it, and she is taken to her bed with what she claims is a fever. The word he spoke was not in any language known to this land, but I understood it perfectly. It was a name, his true name, not the James that Jonathan insisted upon. I cannot transcribe it here. Human letters are insufficient, but when he spoke it, I felt the waters of his true home surge within my blood. They are coming, as I have always known they would. The time approaches when decisions must be made. I find I have already made mine. The final legible entry was dated January 9th, 1853, the day before the fire at the Beaufort property. They are close now. I can feel them moving beneath the waves, drawing nearer with each tide. Jonathan believes he has hidden us away here, protected his precious reputation from scandal by removing us from society's gaze. He does not understand that this was always the destination. The sea calls to its own. James barely sleeps now. He watches the water through the window, his beautiful eyes reflecting patterns of light that I have come to recognize as communication. Tonight, when the house is quiet, I will take him to the shore. They will come with the midnight tide. I have instructed Mary to deliver my final message to Jonathan, though I doubt she will be believed. Sarah suspects too much. Her loyalty to the Whitfield family runs too deep to be trusted with what must occur. I regret what awaits her, but some prices must be paid for transcendence. My son, for he is mine, if not Jonathan's, will return to his rightful people. And I have been offered a choice: the land or the depths. How could any woman who has seen what I have seen choose differently? Jonathan laughed when I first spoke of the stranger in the field. He will not laugh when he learns how right I was to fear, and how wrong he was to doubt. The discovery of Rebecca's journal reignited scholarly interest in the Whitfield case, though academic publications remained reluctant to engage with its more inexplicable elements. A footnote in a 1971 monograph on Antebellum women's mental health dismissed the journal as elaborate delusions consistent with postpartum psychosis, possibly complicated by Foley deducts involving household staff. This clinical interpretation, however, failed to account for the physical evidence that continued to accumulate around the case. In 1972, marine archaeologists mapping the seafloor approximately 1 mile off the coast from the former Beaufort property discovered an unusual formation that defied geological explanation. Sonar readings revealed what appeared to be a perfectly circular depression, approximately 50 feet in diameter, descending vertically into the seabed to a depth that exceeded their equipment's range. Initial plans to explore the formation with diving equipment were abandoned after 2 team members reported experiencing intense auditory and visual hallucinations while in the vicinity. The project's funding was subsequently redirected to less controversial research areas, and the formation was marked on nautical charts simply as natural seafloor anomaly, vessel caution advised. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the Whitfield case retreated once more into obscurity, referenced occasionally in compilations of Southern Gothic folklore or as a historical curiosity in regional publications. The wall along the eastern boundary of the former farm began to crumble after the trust funds were exhausted. and the property changed hands several times, eventually becoming part of a large agricultural conglomerate that converted the tobacco fields to commercial pine forest. In 2004, an unexpected connection to the case emerged when a marine biology graduate student at the University of Georgia began researching unusual genetic variations in coastal fish populations. Tara Williams, conducting DNA analysis of specimens collected along the South Carolina coast, identified a previously undocumented genetic marker in several species that appeared with statistically significant frequency in samples taken near Hunting Island and the Beaufort area. The marker, which affected the development of the specimen's eyes, resulting in unusually vertical pupils and enhanced reflective properties, could not be readily explained by known evolutionary mechanisms. Williams' research paper, published in a respected marine biology journal, made no reference to the Whitfield case. Indeed, there is no evidence that Williams was aware of the historical parallel to her scientific findings. However, her faculty advisor, Dr. Robert Chen, had grown up in Greene County and recognized the potential connection. His personal correspondence, later donated to the university archives, reveals his decision not to mention the historical case to his student. While the coincidence is certainly striking, I see no scientific benefit in burdening Tara's excellent research with associations to local folklore, however documented that folklore might be. The genetic anomaly she has identified deserves to be evaluated on its scientific merits alone. Still, I find myself returning to the old stories my grandfather told about the Whitfield infant with strange eyes, and I cannot help but wonder if we are observing the distant echo of something that entered the coastal ecosystem 150 years ago. Science has no methodology for such speculations, so they remain private thoughts, not public hypotheses. Dr. Chen's caution was perhaps warranted. Williams' research secured significant funding for continued study of genetic anomalies in marine life along the South Carolina coast, leading to several important discoveries regarding adaptation to changing ocean conditions. Had her work been tainted by association with the Whitfield case, such support might have been less forthcoming. In 2011, during the renovation of the Greene County Courthouse, workers discovered a sealed compartment within the cornerstone that contained several documents from the 1850s, including a previously unknown deposition from Dr. Harrison regarding his final visit to the Whitfield farm in December 1852. This document, remarkably well preserved due to the airtight nature of its container, contained details that had not appeared in his official medical records. I herein record observations which I deemed inappropriate for medical documentation, as they reflect personal impressions rather than clinical facts. Nevertheless, I feel compelled to create this record, should future circumstances warrant its consultation. The child born to Rebecca Whitfield exhibits several anomalies beyond the unusual appearance of his eyes. His skin, while appearing normal in full light, displays a faint luminescence in darkness. When I examined his hands, I noted a subtle webbing between the fingers, not pronounced enough to be considered a deformity, but definitely present. Most disturbing was the incident that occurred during my final visit on December 12th. While examining the infant, I observed what appeared to be gill-like structures forming along his neck, just below the jawline. When I attempted to touch these formations, The child grasped my wrist with strength no 3-month-old should possess. In that moment of contact, I experienced a vision so vivid and disturbing that I immediately attributed it to exhaustion or perhaps the effects of the brandy I had consumed before my visit. I found myself standing not in the Whitfield nursery, but on a shore of black sand facing an ocean that glowed with internal light. Figures moved in the illuminated depths, their forms suggesting human shape, but wrongly proportioned, elongated. They were watching me with eyes identical to the infant's. The vision lasted only seconds before I pulled my hand free from the child's grip, but the memory of it has disturbed my sleep ever since. I have not shared these observations with Jonathan Whitfield, whose mental state appears increasingly fragile, nor have I included them in my medical records, as they would likely be interpreted as evidence of my own compromised judgment, rather than factual documentation. I deposit this statement in the courthouse cornerstone, which I know is to be sealed during next month's centennial celebration, in the hope that should similar phenomena be observed in the future, this record might provide some context, however fantastic it may seem. The discovery of Dr. Harrison's deposition prompted renewed interest in the Whitfield case among a small group of researchers specializing in historical anomalies. In 2013, an interdisciplinary team secured permission to conduct limited archaeological excavation at the site of the former Beaufort property. Their findings, while not conclusive, added further layers to the already complex narrative. Ground-penetrating radar revealed that the foundation of the house that burned in 1853 had been built atop an older structure, apparently a circular stone arrangement consistent with pre-Columbian native settlements in the coastal region. Carbon dating of charcoal fragments found within this older structure suggested it had been actively used as recently as the early 19th century, despite historical records indicating that the indigenous population had been forcibly removed from the area decades earlier. More curiously, the excavation team discovered a cache of small carved objects, primarily crafted from a dense black stone not native to the region. These carvings, approximately 3 inches in height, depicted humanoid figures with elongated limbs and oversized almond-shaped eyes. Several of the figures appeared to be emerging from or returning to wave-like formations at their base. The carvings were sent to the University of Georgia for analysis, but the findings were never published in peer-reviewed literature. Unofficial reports suggested that the material defied conventional geological classification, with molecular structures more consistent with deep-sea volcanic formations than any stone found on the North American mainland. By 2015, the various threads of the Whitfield case, historical, archaeological, and biological, had attracted attention beyond academic circles. A television production company, specializing in paranormal documentaries, sent a film crew to Greene County with the intention of producing an episode centered on the story. Their initial research and filming proceeded without incident until they attempted to access the eastern boundary of the former farm, where remnants of Jonathan Whitfield's wall still stood among the pine trees. According to statements made by the production team, after abandoning the project, a series of equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena convinced them to redirect their focus to more conventional historical mysteries. Cameras failed at specific locations. Audio recordings captured rhythmic sounds that could not be heard by the human ear during recording. And most concerning, 3 crew members reported having identical dreams on consecutive nights. Dreams of standing on a shoreline facing a luminous ocean while being observed by figures beneath the waves. The producer, in an interview with a paranormal enthusiast website, stated, "I've worked on dozens of supposedly haunted locations, cryptid hunts, you name it. Most of the time we have to work hard to create any sense of the uncanny, because these places are just places with stories attached to them." But the old Whitfield property was different. There was something there that didn't want to be filmed. Or maybe something that wanted to do the watching instead of being watched. Either way, some stories aren't meant to be told through our medium. This is one of them. Perhaps the most puzzling development in the modern history of the Whitfield case came in 2017, when genealogical researchers attempting to map historical farming families made an unexpected discovery. The last male heir of Jonathan Whitfield's line, a 73-year-old retired naval engineer named Richard Whitfield living in Portland, Oregon, agreed to DNA testing as part of the project. The results revealed genetic markers unprecedented in the database. Markers that, according to the puzzled technicians, showed significant divergence from standard human genome sequencing. When the anomalies were brought to Richard Whitfield's attention, his reaction was reportedly one of unsurprised resignation. "There have always been rumors in our family," he told researchers, "about Rebecca and the child that wasn't really a Whitfield. My grandfather used to say we carried the ocean in our blood, and that someday it would call us home. I never understood what he meant until I joined the Navy. 30 years at sea, and I never once felt seasick. Always felt more at home on water than on land." Richard Whitfield died of natural causes 6 months after this interview. His will contained an unusual provision. His body was to be cremated and his ashes scattered at sea, specifically at a location 1 mile off the coast from the former Beaufort property, directly above the circular depression discovered by marine archaeologists in 1972. The ceremony was conducted by the captain of a private charter boat, who later reported that as the ashes touched the water surface, they seemed to glow momentarily before descending into the depths. The final documented chapter of the Whitfield saga came in September 2019, when a Category 3 hurricane made landfall near Beaufort, South Carolina. The storm, while destructive to coastal infrastructure, took an unusual path once it moved inland, weakening rapidly except for a concentrated area of intense wind and rain that tracked directly to the former Hickory Hollow Farm in Greene County, more than 300 miles from the coast. Meteorologists were unable to explain this atmospheric anomaly, which defied established models of hurricane behavior. In the storm's aftermath, local officials discovered that the remnants of Jonathan Whitfield's wall along the eastern boundary of the property had been completely obliterated, not merely damaged as in previous instances, but pulverized to the point that no trace of the foundation remained. In its place, residents of neighboring properties reported finding hundreds of small objects scattered across the area. Black stone carvings identical to those discovered at the Beaufort site 6 years earlier. Most of these carvings were collected by curious locals as souvenirs before authorities could document them properly. One, however, was turned over to the Greene County Historical Society, where it remains on display in a small exhibit dedicated to the Whitfield case. This particular carving differs from those previously discovered in one significant detail. The figure depicted has the elongated limbs and oversized eyes common to all the sculptures, but it also appears to be carrying a smaller figure in its arms, a child. The placard accompanying this exhibit offers a cautiously worded summary of the case, concluding with what might be the most appropriate epitaph for this strange chapter in Tennessee's history. The story of Rebecca Whitfield and her son represents a unique confluence of documented historical events and enduring mystery. While conventional explanations involving mental illness, marital discord, and tragic accident cannot be dismissed, neither can they fully account for the persistent patterns of unusual phenomena associated with this case across more than 160 years. Perhaps the most telling detail lies in Rebecca's final message to her husband. He was right not to trust his eyes, but wrong not to trust hers. In the interplay between perception and reality, between the seen and the unseen, the Whitfield case reminds us that history's darkest corners may contain truths for which our understanding remains inadequate. Visitors to Greene County today will find little to mark the former site of Hickory Hollow Farm. The commercial pine forest that replaced the tobacco fields is scheduled for harvesting next year. The main house foundation was bulldozed decades ago to make way for modern agricultural equipment. Only the family cemetery remains, enclosed by a rusting iron fence and largely reclaimed by the Tennessee underbrush. Local residents still speak of unusual occurrences in the area. Lights seen moving through the pine trees on September nights when the moon is full. The sound of waves crashing where no water exists. Children born occasionally with unusual amber-colored eyes. These stories are told as curiosities, tourist attractions, the kind of local color that any region accumulates over centuries of habitation.